In 1928, a small, unassuming mold changed our world. Alexander Fleming, a Scottish scientist, returned from holiday. He found a petri dish contaminated with this fungus. Around the mold, bacteria had mysteriously vanished. Fleming had stumbled upon penicillin, a true medical marvel. This discovery would rewrite the story of medicine. It offered a powerful new weapon against deadly infections. The age of antibiotics was about to begin, quite by chance. Imagine a world where this moment never happened. What if Fleming had simply discarded that moldy dish? The consequences would be almost too vast to comprehend. Our history, our lives would be starkly different. Infections, now trivial, would remain terrifying killers. The absence of penicillin is a chilling thought experiment. It reveals how much we owe to this single lucky observation. The discovery was a pivotal point in human health. It was a monumental step forward for all humankind. Without it, the 20th century would have unfolded very differently. The significance of penicillin cannot be overstated. It became the first true antibiotic, a lifesaver. Before its arrival, doctors had few effective tools. They fought a losing battle against many bacterial diseases. Before penicillin, there was a glimmer of hope. This hope came in the form of sulfa drugs. These were developed in the early 1930s. They were the first chemical substances to treat bacterial infections. Sulfa drugs like Prontosil showed remarkable promise. They could combat some infections like streptococcal ones. For a time, they seemed like a medical revolution. Doctors finally had something in their arsenal. It was a step beyond mere supportive care for patients. These drugs offered a chance, however slim, against infection. However, the power of sulfa drugs was limited. They were not effective against all types of bacteria. Many dangerous pathogens remained completely resistant. Staphylococcal infections, for example, often shrugged them off. Furthermore, sulfa drugs could have serious side effects. Patients might suffer from kidney damage or allergic reactions. The dosage had to be carefully managed by physicians. Their use required caution and constant monitoring. This meant they were not a universal solution. The search for safer, broader-spectrum treatments continued. Doctors relied heavily on these early antimicrobial agents. In a world without penicillin, infections ruled with terror. A simple cut from a rose thorn could be a death sentence. A scraped knee on a child could lead to amputation. Bacteria, invisible to the naked eye, were formidable foes. Common illnesses like strep throat or bronchitis often escalated. They could quickly develop into life-threatening conditions. Pneumonia was a dreaded killer, especially for the weak. The young and the elderly were particularly vulnerable. Every fever, every wound carried a heavy weight of fear. The shadow of infection loomed large over daily life. Childbirth, a joyous occasion, was also fraught with peril. Puerperal fever, or childbed fever, claimed many mothers. This devastating infection could strike after delivery. Without effective antibiotics, doctors were often helpless. They could only offer comfort and hope for the best. The joy of new life was often overshadowed by this risk. Families faced the heartbreaking possibility of losing a mother. This tragedy was a common occurrence in the pre-antibiotic era. The absence of penicillin would mean this fear continued unabated. Many more mothers and infants would have been lost. Minor injuries, now easily treated, pose significant threats. Without the miracle of penicillin, life itself would be shorter. Average life expectancy would be significantly lower. This is a stark reality of a world without antibiotics. Infectious diseases were major killers in the early 20th century. They cut down people in the prime of their lives. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and influenza claimed millions. Penicillin and subsequent antibiotics changed this dramatically. They added years, even decades, to average lifespans. The absence of this discovery would mean a return to shorter lives. A world where reaching old age was a much rarer achievement. Child mortality rates would remain heartbreakingly high. Infants and young children are especially vulnerable to infections. Diseases like diphtheria, scarlet fever, and whooping cough were rampant. Many children would not survive to see their 5th birthday. The loss of a child was a common tragedy for families. Penicillin offered a way to combat many of these childhood killers. Its absence would mean these devastating losses continued. Families would be smaller, not by choice but by fate. The joyous sounds of childhood would be too often silenced. The future of society would be diminished by these early deaths. The impact would be felt across all age groups. Section 5. War and Wounds, the battlefield without penicillin. World War II raged across continents, a brutal conflict. Soldiers faced not only bullets and bombs but also infection. Battlefield wounds, even minor ones, could quickly turn deadly. Dirt, debris, and bacteria contaminated injuries easily. Without penicillin, the fate of many wounded soldiers was grim. Infections like gas gangrene spread rapidly through damaged tissue. Sepsis, or blood poisoning, was a common and feared complication. Doctors on the front lines fought a desperate battle. They had limited tools to stop these relentless microbial invaders. The scale of suffering would have been immense. Amputation was often the only way to save a life. If an infection in a limb could not be controlled, removal was necessary. This was a drastic measure with lifelong consequences. Soldiers faced the prospect of losing arms or legs. This was to prevent the infection from spreading further. The sight of field hospitals filled with amputees would be common. The psychological toll on these men would be devastating. Penicillin, when it became available, dramatically reduced amputations. It allowed doctors to treat infections effectively. It saved limbs and, more importantly, saved lives. The availability of penicillin was a closely guarded secret initially. Section 6. Surgery's Perilous Path, the Scalpel's Double Edge. In a world without penicillin, surgery was a dangerous gamble. Every incision, every operation carried a high risk. The risk was post-operative infection, a surgeon's nightmare. Even with the most skilled hands and cleanest techniques, bacteria could invade the surgical site and wreak havoc. This constant threat severely limited what surgeons could attempt. Complex, life-saving operations we now take for granted, operations like organ transplants or open-heart surgery, these would be almost unthinkable. Far too risky. The scalpel, a tool of healing, was also a potential bringer of death. Surgeons of the pre-antibiotic era lived with this reality. They knew that their best efforts could be undone by infection. They would perform operations only when absolutely necessary. Exploratory surgery was often a death sentence itself. The fear of infection shaped every decision in the operating room. Antiseptics like carbolic acid were used extensively, but these were harsh and could damage tissues. They were not as effective as internal antibiotics. Section 7. The Inevitable Discovery, the Slow March of Science. If Alexander Fleming had missed his moldy dish, what then? Would penicillin have remained hidden forever? Science rarely relies on a single individual. Other researchers were exploring microbes. They sought ways to combat harmful bacteria. The concept of antibiosis was known. Louis Pasteur observed this decades earlier. Another scientist might have made a similar find. Perhaps someone studying soil bacteria. The march of science often finds a way. However, the timeline could have been very different. Fleming's discovery was a blend of chance and observation. The specific strain of Penicillium notatum was key. The weather conditions in London played a role. These factors might not have aligned for another researcher. It could have taken many more years, even decades. During that time, millions more would have died from infections. The urgency of World War II spurred penicillin's development. Without that pressure, a later discovery might have been slower to scale up. The what-if is not just about discovery but also about timing. Consider the work of other scientists at the time. Section 8. Guarding against germs, a different approach to healing. In a world denied penicillin, medical practices would adapt. The focus would shift even more heavily towards prevention. If curing bacterial infections was so difficult, avoiding them was paramount. Hygiene and sanitation would be the primary lines of defense. Public health campaigns would stress meticulous cleanliness. Hand washing, already important, would be elevated to a sacred ritual. Hospitals would enforce even stricter isolation protocols. Patients with infectious diseases would be kept far from others. This would be to prevent outbreaks within medical facilities. The fear of contagion would shape hospital design and patient care. The use of antiseptics would be widespread and aggressive. Doctors would rely on substances like iodine and carbolic acid. These chemicals could kill bacteria on surfaces and skin. However, they were often harsh and could damage living tissue. Using them to treat internal infections was highly problematic. The search for better, less toxic antiseptics would continue, but these would still be a far cry from targeted antibiotics. Wound care would be meticulous, focused on preventing infection. Every cut and abrasion would be treated with utmost seriousness. The goal was to stop bacteria before they could gain a foothold. Section 9. A world transformed, the legacy of a moldy dish. The discovery of penicillin was a fundamental turning point in human history. A single, observant scientist and a stray spot of mold unleashed a revolution. A revolution that has saved millions of lives. Modern life without antibiotics is unimaginable. Our health and well-being depend on them, from treating infections to enabling complex surgeries. Fleming's world, plagued by bacterial disease, is now alien to many. This transformation is the enduring legacy of that moldy dish.